Hi, everyone. It's Ashley Gronewald with Hunter Row Real Estate, and I have Meredith Delbridge joining me again. If you haven't already listened to a couple of our sessions, we've had some awesome conversations about just eating disorders, body image, those type of related topics. And so this one was one I was really excited to talk with Meredith about, diet culture and body image, because I think this unfortunately plagues our American way of life. And so I want to hear from the expert, Meredith. And like I shared before, we have known each other from attending the same church for a while, doing some counseling together, and then also working in the real estate realm. So we have lots of connections, which is awesome. And so Meredith, go ahead and jump in, introduce yourself, and then I want to get through these questions because I have really great ones and I think our listeners will really want to hear them. So tell us who you are.
Yeah, so I'm Meredith and I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor. I have a practice in North Raleigh. I work with adults, adolescents. I specialize in treating eating disorders. So I have my certification as an eating disorder specialist, but I also work with, people of all kinds who just want to work through any kind of general mental health.
So we'll get your contact information out there. So if anyone listening says, I want to reach out to Meredith, know that it'll be here for you to connect with her. But let's jump into this diet culture and body image topic that I think will affect a lot of us. And so how do you see this diet culture hurting us as individuals spiritually and emotionally? How are you seeing that from a clinical perspective?
Yeah, so I think from a spiritual standpoint, I really think that diet culture is a tool that the enemy uses to distract us. So I just see it being such a distraction from so many things in our lives, whether it's even just, the way that it can take people away from their families or their friendships or their marriages, whether it's like physically taking them away because they're wanting to be at the gym or all the time, or just mentally, being just distracted and thinking about, what they ate or what they didn't eat or how they feel about their body and the way that that makes them feel. And so I think, honestly, I just see it being such a distraction. And I feel like, I know so many just awesome, strong, successful women who really spend so much of their time and energy focused on their bodies and food. And I often think, goodness, what could we be doing with all of this time and energy? And even just in terms of how we serve, serve the Lord, but even just spiritually, just, our relationship with the Lord. And so I think it pulls us away from that. I think it causes us to focus on ourselves rather than, be others focused. And so I think there's a lot of aspects that impact us spiritually when we're focused on dieting or our bodies. And I think that spills over into the emotional component as well. So I think, for anyone that has been on a diet, you probably know that it's not fun. And, you might feel hungry a lot of the time, and that often makes you cranky. And I think emotionally, it makes you not feel so good. I often think of it as like an emotional roller coaster, right? Like you might lose a little bit of weight and feel amazing, and then you gain it back and you feel horrible. And maybe physically you feel horrible. But I think from an emotional standpoint, I do think there's so many highs, so many lows. And I don't think that's a great place for us to be. I think having kind of more of a stable, relationship with food allows us to have kind of a steady emotional place, in other areas of our lives too.
And I would say, I said this after I had Parker, I felt like the first year of his life, I was there physically, but mentally I was very distracted because I was so uncomfortable with my postpartum nursing body that I felt like I missed that year. And it gives me such pain. I remember feeling that in the moment of I'm missing this because I'm so hyper focused on something that has little to no eternal value at all.
Right.
And I'm missing really important milestones and just sweet time with him. So I can totally relate to that for sure. And then I think there's been studies, I don't know if it was World War II, Holocaust related, but these people that had been starved to death, and then they bring food in picture form where they become obsessed with cookbooks or whatever, just dreaming and thinking about food. And you just think about, that's kind of what's happening, I would think, with dieting. When you're taking away something that your body either needs, wants, or craves, now you have this hypersensitivity and focus on it. So now it's like you can't even focus on work well or being with your kids well because you're thinking about the next meal or whatever it is that you're craving. So it's just a really unhealthy cycle to be on and mental space to be in.
Yes, for sure. And I think you touched on something so important that I think diets tend to like create this sense of deprivation.
Mm-hmm.
So you're deprived. And so what happens is, of course, you're thinking about food all the time. You know, it's like if you tell your child, you can play with any toy except for that one, which toy do they want to play with, right? That's the only one they want to play with. So I think it's like that with food, where when we say, okay, I'm going to stop eating this food group, or I'm going to stop eating desserts, or immediately I think your body starts craving or wanting the things that you're telling it can't have. And so it can become this obsessive, mindset, which, just isn't healthy. And it doesn't feel good.
Agreed. Moving on to the next question. What are the repercussions physically of our diet culture? What are you seeing? I mean, we're talking about the emotional space, but what about physically?
Yeah. So physically. So, the first thing I'll say is that for a lot of people, they could just innocently say, oh, I want to just lose a few pounds. Like, I want to feel better. Summer's coming. And that can trigger a full-blown eating disorder. And I've seen that happen with so many of my clients. And it also happens where people can diet and that doesn't happen. So it doesn't happen to every single person, but it is definitely a precursor to developing an eating disorder. So diets can be really dangerous. I would also say physically that, I often think of like chronic dieters or people that are, chronically dieting. Think of like kind of more of like a yo-yo diet where people are losing weight and then they're gaining the weight back. And then sometimes they're gaining more back and then they're losing it again and they're gaining it, And so it's this cycle. And what happens, it's called weight cycling. And what happens is, that puts a lot of stress on your body over time when you're continuing to lose and gain and lose and gain. And it's honestly, it's not healthy for your cardiovascular system. It's, it can be really unhealthy for your body. I also think just from physically, when I think about how God designed our bodies, I think he was really intentional about how he made us. And, I think about like plants, right? Like they need sunlight and chlorophyll and carbon dioxide or whatever else they need to make food for themselves. But he didn't make us that way. Like he gave us taste buds where we can taste and we can enjoy food. And he gave us the ability to experience hunger and feel when we're hungry and to feel fullness and to know when we're full. And so when we experience like physical symptoms like hunger, and we, what diet culture would say is that, if sometimes when we're hungry, we're not supposed to eat something. So what we're doing is we're essentially ignoring hunger cues. And I think that, ultimately, I think that creates this place where we're not in alignment with like how God ultimately designed our bodies to function physically. So that's another thing I think about, just from the standpoint of diets and when we stop listening to our bodies, I think it throws so many things out of whack. Sometimes people lose their hunger and fullness cues completely because they've ignored them for so long. And that's, again, that's not a great place to be. So I think there's a lot of physical ramifications, but those are a few.
Yeah, I think of like in college when this became something for me, just amenorrhea being something where a woman loses her menstrual cycle.
Yeah.
And then I think it can definitely impact your ability potentially to get pregnant, because if your body feels a state of starvation, I think it can be harder for it to say this is a safe place to develop a child. I've definitely heard that before, of just like stress, but also starvation or over-exercising where it's not a safe place for a baby to be born or raised. and grown in the womb. So I think of that. And then I think of all of the chemical imbalances that happen in your brain as you're just really messing with a very scientific but God-given ordained system that works. But when we start messing with our minerals and our the electrolytes, and then seeing that we're running off of adrenaline versus running off of the fuel we need from food, and just how that can like zap our chemical stores of hormones and all of those types of balances we need. And I think the other thing is like our body wants a sense of homeostasis. So when you said that weight cycling, I think is what you called it. I've never heard of that before, but our body wants to be at a homeostasis, a safe kind of place. And so that yo-yo of going up, coming down, going up versus just maintaining homeostasis, that's something to consider. Like, is it worth the agony that it takes to lose that 5 to 10 pounds when you're just going to gain it back once you go back, your body pulls you back to homeostasis?
Yeah. And I think even like a deeper question is like, why? Like you can go to all that trouble and, you're cycling, and again, it's like this distraction. It's taking up so much time. It's taking up so much energy. It's taking up so much thought and sometimes money. And it's like, for what? Like what is ultimately underneath that? That's so important. And I think that can also be, I didn't mention this, I don't think, but spiritually it can be, because it's an idol. It's something that we're, that feels so important, that whether it's identity or how it defines us, how we appear to other people. So I think it goes pretty deep. It can. So.
And what would you recommend then? Because this is the culture that we live in. And I think it's interesting, from when I was being raised, it was like the fat-free diet. And then it became the Atkins diet of high fat. And then, now we've got paleo, keto, whole 30, like it goes on and on, but it seems like it cycles, like low carb, high carb, just so we think we've got the magic bullet or the magic pill that's going to cure all of our weight struggles with these new diets that aren't new, they're from old, but we're just manipulating our body for seasons to try and get results. So how would you encourage us that live in this world it's having negative effects on us physically, emotionally, spiritually, to navigate it? What do we do? We're in it. We can't get out of it. What do we do?
Yeah, it's such a good question and so hard. So I think, we are all in this world, right? Like we're living under the same diet culture. And I think it's first really important to acknowledge that it's a $70+ billion industry. So I think like recognizing that there's probably quite a bit of deception going on, that we're all a little deceived by it, that we spend so much money, pouring into this industry that isn't really fixing anything. It's not really helping anything. It's profitable. I tend to think about, just because we are hearing or seeing messages about, having certain kinds of bodies or being fit enough or, fitting in a certain size or comparing ourselves to this person or that person or the kind of media that we expose ourselves to, I think we have to be really discerning about what we choose to input, because we can't get away from it. Like we're going to be around it. And so I often tell people like who you surround yourself with, that's important, and the kinds of things that you expose yourself to, like that's important. And I feel like it's like a more common topic for people to kind of talk about, like, filtering their social media, like seeing what, something doesn't serve you, like maybe don't look at it, or, if something's not healthy, then unfollow, or, don't be looking at things that are not going to be helpful for your mental health. But I think with diet culture, I think it goes beyond that. It's like, what kind of movies are you watching? What kind of people are you seeing? What kind of, when you listen to podcasts, like what are they talking about? And, I think that diet culture reaches so far that you could listen to like any topic of anything, and you're going to hear someone make a joke about how, about their body, or they're going to make a joke about, how they ate too much or how they need to lose weight. And, you can't escape it. But I think it's just like, how do we learn to be discerning and see where maybe there's deception or lies that we're believing about our bodies? I think that's, one way that we can kind of navigate that.
And I think I've shared that before of like, I don't know when it was, but years past, I said, I am not going to look at magazines, specifically fitness ones,
Right.
body image focus ones. Like I can't handle that. Whereas other people can.
Right.
I can't. It is not good for me. I
Right.
think I saw a stat one time of like how bad a woman feels about themselves after looking at a magazine cover, even in the checkout line at a grocery store. Like your self-esteem, your feel-goodness drops drastically. It's like, it's not worth it to me. Even though it can be tempting to say, I want that, I want to read more or look at more, all it is pulling you down a very dark rabbit hole.
Right.
And so I've got a pretty hard and fast on that. Like, I just don't, I'm not bringing them into my home. I'm not looking at them because I can't handle that type of input. Like you said, like be discerning. And then I'm very rigid about what I watch because it can just take me down a path I don't want to go on to where now I'm angry. I'm, outlashing on my kids because I'm feeling I don't measure up to what our culture has said is supposed to be. And so I think that's really wise to think about that for sure. What you're exposing yourself to, what your kids are being exposed to through you or not. And trying to eliminate, you can't totally live in a bubble, but eliminate that and surround yourself with other people that are aware of that not being a healthy thing to bring into our eyes. Like it says in the Bible, like Job made a covenant with his eyes. I feel like that verse was for me too. Not just men to make a covenant with their eyes, but for me to not, same thing like a man lusting over a woman, me doing the same thing, but wanting what they have. Right. Because it meets the standard that I have in my mind or what our culture has said is the standard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's so true. And, I think it's hard because it's, it is all around us. But I think the other thing, and I'll just say this real quick, but I think that that's also why it's so important to be rooted, like to know who you really are, like in Christ, and like what your real identity is, because it's so easy to see all of these different things. And, whether it's images, people's conversations, what people are choosing to do or where or whatever like might impact you. It's like, I think the more like rooted you are, like, I don't, it's not that I think those things won't affect you at all, but I think that as you build yourself up in Christ, like, I think those things don't have the same power over you. And so I think that's another thing that can also be helpful. It's just like, know your worth, like know like who you are in Christ. And I think that like out of that, like your reaction or the impact that diet culture has on you, I just don't think it will have the same power in the end.
That's so good. And what thought came to my mind when you were saying is like a man wants a woman who is not obsessed with those things because it's miserable to live with. I mean, ask Jed. But it's like a shell of a woman versus someone who isn't so obsessed with being the best and perfect and beautiful based on a standard that's not realistic. Instead, they're accepting of who they are and have compassion for other people. Like you said, they're not so navel gazing that they can't see other people and appreciate their beauty and gifts that aren't necessarily physical, but just what they have to offer. Right. So I think that's something to consider, because as much as I think women think a man wants this beauty idol picture, I think really what they want is someone who's real, that they can connect with and love, and who loves them on a deeper level, not just a physical level that's going to fade. So a couple more questions for you. How do you distinguish between body focused American culture and body image obsession?
So, I actually don't know if I can distinguish between the two. I don't know. Like, I'm curious to hear what you think about that. I mean, I think there might be like a shade of gray in there where there's maybe a little bit of a difference. But I think when I think about trying to distinguish, I think it kind of goes back to like motives and heart. And for one person, what could be like, obsession, for another person, it might not be. I mean, I think there are definitely things we could say are obsessive or, that are not. But I do think that there's, this nuance of like, I think some of it is like your motives and your heart and what's happening in your head. For someone that maybe exercises 30 minutes a day, we might say, well, that's really like moderate. That's no big deal. But for someone, like if they don't get that 30 minutes in and it ruins their day, I would say that's obsessive. Even though we would say, well, that's just like a body focused American. Like they just want to get their workout in. I would say, I don't know. Like, I don't think it should impact your mood if you miss your workout. I mean, it's something that makes you feel good and it, relieves stress and you might really enjoy it. So it's a bummer, but so I don't know. I'm curious what you think about that.
So I just read a book. It's called Dinner for Two, and it's very good. I'd highly, highly recommend it, but just about a woman who has an eating disorder and navigating it with her Christian husband as they work through it. And one thing that I think comes to mind, like with this idea is, like, I can go to the gym, like you said, the motivation factor. I can go every day and not be in sin or struggle. It's just something that I do and I like. But it's like, when does something get in the way of that? How do you respond?
Exactly.
Is it like, I will at all costs make this happen, even if it means my kids are not well taken care of, my husband is stressed because he has to step in where I've, dropped off the kids, or whatever it is. The thing in the book that they put out is like an exercise questionnaire. Is it an obsession that's become an idol that needs some health and healing and backing away? Or is it something that is really good for our body that you use as a stress reliever? I think it comes down to the motivation. So I don't think you can look at somebody who goes to the gym every day and say they struggle with body image and an eating disorder, but you'd have to know their motivation behind why they go. I mean, my counselor in marriage, he says, you go to the gym, Ashley, to give yourself a hug. Yeah. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. He's like, it's your coping mechanism for life. And it doesn't mean that that's necessarily bad, but if it's only, at all costs, it must happen, or my day is thrown off, or I don't feel good about myself, that's when it's been lifted to a much higher level than it should be. So I do think that it's a slippery slope. If you have a focus on body, I think it will end up to be an obsession. And she says that in the book too. It's like habits related to like health like this, where you go and reinforce that mindset of I'm at the gym and I'm reinforcing the idea that skinniness or beauty is the ultimate thing. Every time I go, I reinforce that message.
Yeah.
So that habit is so deeply rooted in our soul, not only just a habitual activity, it's rooted in our soul, that unwinding that is really difficult because that message is being played out on a very consistent basis.
Yeah.
So hard.
Yeah.
So what about if we shift to, as a believer, how do believers distinguish the difference between taking care of their body, because that's very biblical, as a temple of God, that we would steward it well, and then abusing it to the point of addiction? Can you help with that?
So this is a little hard to answer, just because, like we were just saying, I think so much of it can be like what's happening in here and here versus like the like actual like physical like exercise we're doing or the eating. Like sometimes I think it could all look really healthy and good, but it may not be, and it may be an addiction, even if it looks totally normal. I was gonna say I did this like continuing education thing around exercise and eating disorders, and the guy who was speaking posted a picture of people exercising, and he said, this is a picture of healthy exercise. And then he posted another picture and he said, this is a picture of unhealthy exercise. And it was the same picture. And the point was like, it literally can look the same. And so it's really hard. I mean, it's a hard question to answer, but I will say, I thought this was really interesting. The 1 Corinthians, where Paul's talking about, our bodies are a temple of the Holy Spirit. He's actually talking about sexual purity, and, our bodies aren't our own, and we were bought at a price. And, and so, yes, we're stewards of our bodies. And so we have to be good stewards of our bodies. And so I think that includes a lot of things, not just purity. But what I will say is I do think that verse gets misused a lot for diet purposes. I think there's like Christian diets out there, and that use verses like this to kind of encourage people. And so I think it's helpful to know like the context of that verse. But what I will say is that I think we want to treat our bodies like well, because like we embody the Holy Spirit, right? Like if the Holy Spirit lives in us, like we want to treat our bodies well. We don't want to starve our bodies. We don't want to, you know, we don't want to binge and purge, and we don't want to, you know, restrict. And we, you know, these are things that, of course, like we don't want to do that. And so I think that, like, I would say maybe a good place to start is if you're trying to figure out, like, okay, as a Christian, like, how do I honor God and my body? It's like, okay, well, let me take a step back and like assess, like, you know, is there anything that I'm doing that is not honoring to God? Am I, like, how much am I thinking about this? How much is it on my mind? How much is it affecting my mood? How much is it affecting my choices, my time? And from there, then we kind of maybe look at, like, how can we make some different, you know, make some changes.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Diane Cook just shared, she said, I just listened to a message about healthy living and body image from a woman's minister named Jess Connolly. And I was going to say that her new book is just coming out. I just pre-ordered it, about body shame.
Yep.
So I haven't read it because it hasn't come out yet, but June 22nd, I believe it comes out. So I ordered that book. And I feel like this message is timely for all of us, because it can be a struggle and you don't even realize it, because it's become normal within our world and our friendships and all of this. And so I think anybody could step back and say, have I taken this to the point of addiction? Has it become an unhealthy idol? Does exercise serve me, or do I serve exercise? Like, who's master and who's slave?
Yeah.
I think, you know, going on vacation is always a really good indicator of how healthy I am with exercise, because it's not usually as easy to make it happen.
Yeah.
And so I think I can trick myself into thinking I'm doing better with exercise than I actually am, until we go on something that disrupts routine, where now I'm feeling anxious. When am I going to get it in? I'm stressing about it. And the people around me are seeing me trying to squeeze it in or figure out ways, you know, where it's just consuming my mind and I'm missing out on vacation. So one other question, how can we have a healthy body image when we are surrounded by these perfect airbrushed bodies? I mean, what my answer is, don't look at them. Like, try to eliminate them as much as you can, because they're not real. I think my natural tendency is to tear them down, to make myself feel better. Like, her body doesn't look like that. I know it doesn't. And she's airbrushed and fake. And that doesn't make me feel any better. I've just torn them down. They're a daughter of someone, and they are a woman that probably struggles. I mean, if you watch any of these documentaries of these famous women, you see most of them had eating disorders. Most of them hate their body or have lived with body shame, and have been not only their own shame, but their producer's shame, their parents' shame, whoever's hoping to get them to this level of stardom they want, and they haven't fit the mold for the body. So, like, having compassion upon those people versus judging them and criticizing them, and then protecting your eyes from seeing that and making it about physical versus what they have inside of them, their heart. Like, don't be the shell of a woman. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say similar. Like, I think that, you know, for most women who you see that look like these perfect, they have, like, quote unquote perfect bodies, or, you know, they kind of fit this, like, ideal type. I often, you know, look at that and just think, you know, again, compassion. Like, I wonder what it took for them to look that way, because it's rare that a body like that exists in nature, right? Like, that's not typically what happens when you just, you know, exist and, you know, feel your body, and, you know, even just normal exercise. Like, I don't know that that's a very typical body type that occurs in nature. And so I think just having compassion, like, wow, you know, I wonder what else she had to go through for that. And we never really know what's going on with people. So, like, sometimes people do, you know, people have eating disorders, and that's why their body looks that way, or maybe they don't, and we don't want to assume. But I think having compassion is important. And I also just think, like you said, we have to filter. Like, we can't, if you're seeing things that trigger you in that way, you just don't look at it. You know, it's like, you don't have to expose yourself to things that, you know, I don't think the answer is to, like, avoid anything that's upsetting to you. That's also not the, you know, the way to do it. But if you're like scrolling on social media and you're like, every time you see this one person and you're like, it's like, makes me feel bad about myself, or like, I just have these like bad thoughts, or it makes me want to obsess about my body, then don't look at it. I just think that's the best way to handle that.
And one thing you said just about what it took to get what this unnatural body may look like, there was a very popular, famous exercise guru who kind of came out and said, I had to finally admit to these people that were just, bowing at my feet saying, you have the body of a goddess. How did you get that? And she was like, miserably. I was absolutely miserable. I couldn't sleep. I had, kind of drugged herself with caffeine to be able to stay awake. But then when she was trying to sleep, she couldn't. And she's living off of miserable type of food to survive. And her producers were encouraging it because, gosh, if you can show this ripped body, people are going to buy that. But at the expense of her marriage, for money. And so for her to come out and kind of say, I have to be honest, don't do what I did, was so encouraging to me. But I think if I can have that mindset about all the people that I might look at as, I want that, ask that question. What did that take? What did they have to sacrifice? And for why? What is it worth? And we are out of time, but I do love this question. I just want to ask it really, really quick. How do Barbies play into little girls' body image?
Oh, yeah. Well, so I think just like we're discerning about, we're talking about discernment for ourselves. I think we want to extend that same discernment for our children. So whether it's like the toys that they play with, the shows that they watch, or the shows they don't watch, or movies, or like books even, really, like, I think that diet culture and beauty ideals can seep through all of that. And so with Barbies, like, I think, there have been lots of different studies. There's been a study that, where even children as little as 3, after they play with Barbies, like they like on like inventories or question, when they're questioned, they tend to prefer, or they're more interested in like smaller bodies, or and so I do think it does have an impact. And I think as parents, like, we get to choose what we let our kids play with. We get to choose, to a certain extent, when they're, at least when they're young. And so I think that it's important that we are discerning about those choices. And I think it's so good for kids to see body diversity too, like to see different, shapes and sizes, because that's what's reflective, I think, of our world.
Yes, for sure. Well, thank you so much for your time. I want to do it again with more of these topics because I think it reaches a really broad spectrum of people that may be struggling with this. And so thank you for your time and wisdom, and we'll do it again for sure. Thanks everybody for listening, and I'll see you next week.